Hello there, and thank you for tuning in to try to see what the world looks like through atheist eyes. I'm Frank Zindler, and I'm your host for this series of programs that I prepared for American Atheists Television. Today's program is titled Books for the Atheist Toolbox. It'll be a show and tell about some books that atheists need to have in their libraries in order to fend off the attacks of religious apologists. Come on, let's take a look at what I've prepared for you. The atheist eyes through which you are being invited to view the world are my eyes. I'm Frank Zindler, and I'm the editor of American Atheist Press. I have named this series of programs after a book I published several years ago. It's called Through Atheist Eyes, Scenes from a World That Won't Reason. It's a 4-volume collection of my shorter writings, accumulated over the last 30 years or so. It contains more than 2,000 pages of essays, articles written for the American Atheist magazine, speeches and annotated debate transcripts, as well as other things composed for the edification and amusement of free thinkers. It can be ordered from the American Atheist website and is also available on Amazon. When I became an atheist activist, way back in the year 1959, I quickly learned that to defend myself against the attacks of religious apologists, I had to have fundamental information in practically every area of human knowledge. I had to have a grasp of all the sciences, philosophy, logic, rhetoric, ancient, medieval, and American history, history of religions, archaeology, historical linguistics, biblical languages, higher criticism, the Old Testament and the New Testament, biblical manuscripts, and contemporary theopolitics and First Amendment issues. Among the sciences, astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology were fundamentally important. Given the fundamentalist claims that the universe is less than 10,000 years old, geology, too, was crucial for exposing the absurdities of creationists like Ken Ham and his even more outrageous predecessors. I rapidly learned that biblical archaeology was not an actual science, but rather was a branch of Christian apologetics. It was intended to prove the Bible with the aid of the spade. I had to learn enough real archaeology to expose the errors and impostures, indeed frauds sometimes, of so much so-called biblical archaeological research. Of course, I had to become an expert in biology, especially those areas central to understanding biological evolution. And for many years I taught evolution-focused biology courses at a branch of the State University of New York. Because we still don't fully understand how life began, I had to study the principles of chemical evolution and keep track of the triumphal series of discoveries bringing us daily closer and closer to a completely non-magical understanding of how life began on Earth. Because creationist debaters routinely make false claims about the second law of thermodynamics, I had to gain practical knowledge of that important principle of physics and chemistry also, in order to deal with religious claims of spirits and souls, demonic possession, sinful behaviors, and things like that. I had to study neuroscience and physiological psychology in order to achieve a non-magical understanding of humans and other animals. I even had to learn hypnosis in order to understand the phenomena of faith healing, religious experiences, and the powerful hold that religious experiences sometimes exert on people. The results of all this arduous study are to be found in these 4 volumes, and you can make use of this information to fight your own battles with the forces of superstition. Volume 1 is subtitled Religions and Scriptures, and contains tons of stuff, some of it a lot of fun, about the Bible, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and cults like Christian Science and Mormonism. There are also important chapters explaining why I don't think that Jesus of Nazareth ever existed. Volume 2 is subtitled Science and Pseudoscience, and contains everything you'll need to combat intelligent designers and other anti-evolutionists. It also has information on research seeking to find ways of slowing down the aging process, and some of my own ideas on how life may have originated on Earth. Again, there's a lot of funny stuff in this volume as well. Stuff like cloning Christs and stalking the elusive mountain boat, the quest for Noah's Ark. Volume 3 is subtitled simply Debates. It contains copiously annotated transcripts of 3 of my most interesting debates. The first is with John P. Koster, author of the book-length ad hominem called The Atheist Syndrome. We atheists are all sick, you see, mentally ill. That debate was simply titled, Does God Exist? The second debate is with John D. Morris of the Institute for Creation Research, and it's called The Question of Noah's Flood. Very informative, exposing some of the deceits and deceptions of creationist apologetics. The third debate is with the greatest creationist superstar debater of all time, Duane T. Gish. That debate was called, Is Creationism Science? To my delight, Gish conceded that creationism wasn't science less than 3 minutes into the debate. A delightful episode in my life as an atheist activist. There's an appendix in Volume 3 that by itself is worth the price of the book. On the Method of Zadig by Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. In it, Huxley showed how science can investigate the past as well as predict the future. The last of my red books, as I call them, has the doofy subtitle Omnium-Gatherum. That's a dog Latin way of saying everything else. It contains essays on philosophy, ethics, atheism and humanism, critiques of arguments for the existence of a God, and most of the funniest stuff I've ever written. It also contains a few music scores and a bunch of poems. And there are 3 excerpts from my never-published book that debunked the Amityville Horror. Appropriately, this is called the Amityville Humbug. I'll probably do a show on that, an entire show on that someday. In a very real sense, I've written these volumes for all of you who are watching this show. Atheists shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. I offer these books to you for that purpose. As I've already noted, the title of these volumes is Through Atheist Eyes, Scenes from a World That Won't Reason. Volume 1, Religions and Scriptures. Volume 2, Science and Pseudoscience. Volume 3, Debates. Volume 4, Omnium-Gatherum. As I indicated earlier, these books are available on the American Atheists website as well as on Amazon. There can be no doubt about it. From the standpoint of potential economic impact, the most important book American Atheist Press has ever published is this modest-sized book by my friend Renee Salm, The Myth of Nazareth, the Invented Town of Jesus. In this book, Renee Salm proves quite conclusively that the Palestinian-Israeli town now called Nazareth was not inhabited at the turn of the era, the time when Jesus of Nazareth and the Holy Family should have been living there. Wow! Think of the consequences. You know there was never a Wizard of Oz, because there are no remnants of the Land of Oz to be found in Kansas. No Land of Oz, no Wizard of Oz. So then, no little town of Nazareth, no, well, you catch on quick. This book proves to me, and my archaeologically savvy friends at least, that Jesus of Nazareth could never have existed. Of course, it remains possible that Jesus of Hoboken or Jesus of Mexico City may once upon a time have existed, or maybe they still do for that matter, with a slight change in the pronunciation of their first name. Think of the economic impact. Israeli tourist income depends heavily on the shekels that credulous Christians spend at the so-called holy sites in the present-day city of Nazareth. A theme park and resort, the so-called Nazareth Village Farm has already invested millions of dollars to try to create, they say recreate, a working farm from the time that Jesus of Nazareth supposedly lived nearby. Just over the big hedge fence that must have been there too, once upon a time. Biblical archaeologists, loosely associated with this commercial adventure, are trying desperately to refute this book. After all, over the long term, billions of dollars are at stake. Given the high incidence, historically, of fraud in the area of archaeological artifacts being discovered, the artifacts that would seem to prove the Bible, I wouldn't be at all surprised if someone soon excavates below a knick-knack kiosk at Nazareth and finds a carpenter's plane with a crudely incised Aramaic inscription reading, "I belong to Joseph of Nazareth." Like all American Atheist Press publications, The Myth of Nazareth by Renee Salm can be purchased on the American Atheists website. That's www.atheists.org. That's atheists, plural, as well as from Amazon. On June 17, 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a ruling saying that forced prayer and devotional Bible readings in the public schools of America was unconstitutional. They ruled that it was a violation of the First Amendment principle of a wall of separation between church and state. The woman behind that decision, the woman who had filed a complaint on behalf of her son William Murray, that was Madalyn Murray, later known as Madalyn Murray O'Hair. The public reaction to the ruling was immediate and violent. Madalyn and her family were repeatedly harassed and even physically assaulted by police. A home invasion by Baltimore police ended forever Madalyn's ability to play Chopin on the piano. They broke her wrist. Life magazine dubbed Madalyn Murray O'Hair the most hated woman in America. Later that year, 1963, Madalyn founded the Society of Separationists, the organization that later was renamed American Atheists in Texas, where Madalyn Murray O'Hair was allowed to use the A word in a corporate name. An Atheist Epic is the highly personal memoir of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, recounting the circumstances leading up to the filing of her lawsuit and some of the violent aftermath, including the crucifixion of her son John's little kitten by Catholic neighbors. Every atheist can be justly proud of the heroism of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and everyone, atheist or not, should read this book. Like all American Atheist Press publications, an Atheist Epic can be ordered online from the American Atheist website, www.atheists.org. That's atheists, plural, and you have to spell it correctly. ATHEISTS. It is also sold on Amazon. Perhaps the most fundamentally useful book for the Atheist Toolbox is this one, the Bible Handbook, a collection of biblical contradictions and divine atrocities, collected by a number of authors, including the British scholars W.P. Ball and G.W. Foote in the late 19th century, and various other scholars up to past the middle of the 20th century. Let me read what I wrote on the back cover for the most recent reprint of this classic. If you are armed with this 19th century classic of atheist biblical scholarship, no Bible-thumping missionary will ever be safe on your doorstep again. You will have all the devastating evidence needed to prove that the so-called Holy Bible is actually holy babble. Many people innocently suppose that the Bible, with its 66 Protestant edition, or 72 books Catholic edition, is the inerrant word of a loving God. If it is inerrant, it cannot contradict itself. If it is the product of a loving deity, it cannot advocate hatred and evil. Materials compiled in the 19th century in England by G.W. Foote and W.P. Ball, as well as a 20th century study by the Australian John Bowden, demonstrate that the scriptures considered sacred by Jews and Christians are actually ghastly, morally outrageous, fatally illogical productions that contradict each other at every turn. The Bible Handbook proves beyond quibble that the Holy Bible is the most imperfect major book ever written by uninspired men. Armed with this book, you'll be able to prove to all your Jewish and Christian friends that they are morally superior to the God they worship. That'll be lots of fun. Get this book. The Bible Handbook by W.P. Ball and G.W. Foote can be ordered online at the American Atheists website, www.atheists.org, and can also be found on Amazon. Who is the leading apologist in America today, trying to sell evangelical, fundamentalist, benighted forms of Christianity? In terms of sales of books, videos, and other paraphernalia, I think the answer to that question has to be Lee Strobel. Although a lawyer by training and not an authority himself in any of the fields in which he defends his faith, he has produced a series of best-selling The Case for ... books, in which he consults alleged experts to obtain supposed evidence of problematic information with which to prop up dubious beliefs that he's bought into, and now wants to sell for a profit, a big profit. He does not appear to have done any competent investigation on his own, nor has he consulted any genuine authorities on the relevant subjects. It is fair to say, I think, that all of Strobel's books are long exercises in the application of the fallacy of informal logic that we call the appeal to authority. Originally published in 1998, his book, The Case for Christ, has now bamboozled and hornswoggled the better part of a generation of Americans. Pretending to make the book look like a legal brief for the defense of an imaginary case against Christ, Strobel assembles the evidence from supposedly qualified witnesses to examine the record. He starts with what he calls the eyewitness evidence, and he asks rhetorically, can the biographies of Jesus be trusted? Where in the world does Strobel find biographies of Jesus? Why, the canonical Gospels, of course. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Next, he pretends to test the supposed eyewitness evidence. Do the biographies of Jesus stand up to scrutiny, he asks. With Strobel's ability to penetrate whole millimeters beneath the surface of the would-be evidence, not surprisingly, he concludes that the novellas we call Gospels do indeed stand up to scrutiny. Then Strobel pursues the so-called documentary evidence. Were Jesus' biographies reliably preserved for us? Well, who could doubt it? Other than an actual Bible scholar, of course. Is there corroborating evidence? Is there credible evidence for Jesus outside his biographies? With the help of Edwin Yamauchi, he is able to manufacture enough evidence to convince even the most credulous of Christians. Of course, there is the problem of biblical archaeology. Something I claim shows that Nazareth didn't exist at the turn of the era, when Jesus and the Holy Family should have been living there. With the aid of Dr. John McCrae, Strobel has no trouble in showing that I don't know what I'm talking about. Of course, he leaves out of the discussion all of the evidence that I had for my claims. But a genuine man of faith has no need to pay attention to such stuff. There is even a student's edition of the book with study guides to give the book the false appearance of a textbook. In the middle of a story about a criminal turned Christian named Ron, who turned himself in to police because of his Christian conscience, Strobel has a question for student readers. Ancient sources say that early Christians clung to their beliefs rather than deny them, even under torture. Ron acted on his belief, even though that's belief in solid capital letters, even though he risked 20 years in prison. Why do you think these people had such strongly held convictions? Well, all this earnest inquiry is intended to support the apologetic claim that the apostles wouldn't have died for a lie, and so their testimony must be true. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you, for a real deal, a wonderful bargain, there's an edition of the Case for Christ that contains a bonus chapter from another one of Strobel's Case for books, The Case for Faith. Such a deal! As I've already indicated, in the Case for Christ, Strobel even misrepresented and criticized some of my own writings. Something had to be done. American Atheist Press was fortunately able to enlist the help of one of the greatest New Testament scholars of our time to write a book-length expose of Strobel's fatuousness, Dr. Robert M. Price. With 2 earned doctorates, not the phony honorary doctorates sported by so many of the biblical apologists, Robert Price is one of the best scholars I could think of to deconstruct and debunk the wild claims of Lee Strobel. Fortunately for us, in his first Case for book, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel drew upon the best known and most prolific apologists alive today, and he brought all their arguments together for easy reading. With all the biggest apologetic ducks huddled together in one small puddle, Dr. Price seized upon the opportunity to blow out of the water the entire field of Christian apologetics in the process of refuting Lee Strobel. Dr. Price outdid even himself when he prepared for us this 300-page handbook, The Case Against the Case for Christ. A New Testament scholar refutes the Reverend Lee Strobel. In this wonderful book, we find comprehensive deconstruction and dismemberment of the most notorious arguments of apologists such as William Lane Craig, Ben Witherington III, Craig Bloomberg, the so-called biblical archaeologists John McCrae and James Strange, Greg Boyd, C.S. Lewis, David A. Carson, and other alleged biblical authorities you've probably never heard of, but who greatly increase what I call the octane rating of the gas that powers the conversion engines of the missionaries and proselytizers. Price has debated most of these guys in formal settings, and so his personal acquaintance with the objects of his criticism greatly increases the value of this book. All the so-called great arguments for the historicity and divinity of Jesus are dissected and exposed to the light of logic in this little book. Price shows conclusively that there are no eyewitness accounts of Jesus, and that the Gospels not only are unreliable witnesses, they are not in any sense historical or biographical documents. Enormous books have been written about the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, all the better to make them easy targets for Dr. Price to puncture. This book, like all of Price's books, is loaded with droll humor. The last chapter is titled, "The Circumcision Evidence is a Supernatural Resurrection The best explanation for folks no longer trimming their sons' foreskins? Well, that preposterous title is actually a fair equivalent of J.P. Moreland's proof of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, keep in mind, the books written by the guy Strobel consulted in his book, The Case for Christ, are basically handbooks for Christians to use in trying to trick you into joining their clubs and paying their dues. They call them tithes, you know. Dr. Price here gives you the cutting tools needed to escape from the nets in which apologists may try to trap you. You need this book. As with all American Atheist Press publications, the case against The Case for Christ is available on the American Atheists website, www.atheists.org. That's atheists, A-T-H-E-I-S-T-S, it's plural, .org. It is also available on Amazon. Later on, I will be devoting a number of entire programs to Mormonism. They'll be a lot of fun. But as a serious threat to your pocketbook, Mormonism is a rather serious matter. For that reason, American Atheist Press was really fortunate to receive a manuscript of the book I hold in my hands. The book is titled Deconstructing Mormonism, an analysis and assessment of the Mormon faith. And it was written by a psychoanalyst and former Mormon apologist, Thomas Riskus. In fact, one of the apologetic articles he wrote for the Encyclopedia of Mormonism is still to be found in the online edition of that work. New Heaven and New Earth is the title of that article. Most amazingly, the manuscript came with a foreword by the world-famous atheist philosopher Kai Nielsen. Now, Nielsen was born in 1926, and this precious foreword may prove to be the last piece of serious writing he will ever publish. This book is causing consternation in the weird world of Mormonism. Let me read you a little bit of a 1,000-word review of this book on Amazon. I have been a Mormon apologist on the internet now for over 15 years. There is nothing I cannot take apart, refute, and show to be fallacious, wrong, incorrect, warped, weird, and wrong-headed. Until now. What is it about this book that has so eviscerated Mormonism, and in turn all Western Christian faiths? A few words first. For one thing, this is simply not an easy book to read. It is serious. There is no other way to describe this. This is not a mere will-o'-the-wisp book or a simple pimple either. It is a huge, brawling 480-pager packed with intense analysis, incredible discussion, penetrating, sincere, serious, and very, very pointed questions for Mormons in the faith. Very dense book, very thorough book analyzing the Mormon concept of God, faith, revelation. On Revelation, pages 297 to 303, is simply going to blow your minds. Now, for a confession. I am singularly unprepared to deal with this. I feel completely inadequate to the task of taking on Riskus. We are losing the battle with the atheists, and we don't even know it yet. It is a most sobering, depressing, and astonishing state of affairs. Good heavens, how are we Mormons going to have a chance, now that our faith and doctrines have been every bit as much and powerfully deconstructed by Riskus as the Christian faith has been deconstructed by the new atheists? I can't take Riskus on. I'm going to be very, very interested in seeing who among Mormon apologists actually bothers to carefully read him. For whichever Mormon apologists deciding to take Riskus on, I say this in all sincerity, good luck. I mean it more than I have ever before. You are seriously going to need it. Trust me, once you read his book, you will understand my last sentence here. You are going to need a whole lot more than your faith, or revelations from God, or in God's help to refute Thomas Riskus's new book, Deconstructing Mormonism. Well, it appears that this was written by the well-known Mormon apologist Kerry Schertz. I must thank him, and I admire him for his intellectual honesty. This is not a quality often found among apologists. Well, follow the advice of a Mormon apologist. Buy this book and read it. Deconstructing Mormonism by the former Mormon apologist Thomas Riskus can be purchased on the American Atheists website, www.atheists.org. Like all American Atheist Press books, it can also be found on Amazon. That's all for today's program. We'll have more books to tell you about in some future programs. Until next time, I'm Frank Zindler.